The most famous couple in human history received one solitary command: be fruitful and multiply. And they did that for centuries. But here's the thing. If you scour the entire Genesis record, you'll find names for the sons: Cain, Abel, Seth. But the daughters? They're just ghosts in the record. This isn't just biblical trivia. It's a study of a silence so profound, it actually shaped how we view history itself. Over the next few minutes, we're going to walk into the shadows of the first human family and ask why the keepers of these stories chose to leave so many voices out. Let's start with the physical reality of the pre-Diluvian world. Now, we don't have descriptions of the geography, but we do have the data of the ages: 900 years of life. That is a time frame our modern minds struggle to even simulate. Think about it. If someone today hits 100, that's a landmark. Adam lived nearly 9 times that. In the ancient world, generations moved fast. People married young, in their teens. So if you do the math, and this is a cold arithmetic exercise, the population growth would have been exponential. In a world where a patriarch lives for 9 centuries, he'd have seen his great-great-great-great-grandchildren not just born, but reaching middle age before he even thought about dying. We aren't talking about a small family unit huddled in a cave. By the time of the flood, we're looking at a population density that could have easily reached into the tens of thousands. This was a bustling, grinding, sweating civilization. It was a world that biologically must have been teeming with activity. Yet, when we look back at the written record, that world is empty. It's a vacuum. There is only the spotlight on the named patriarchs, and around them, a deep, thick, historical shadow. We are looking for people who were there, who built structures, who tilled the earth, who labored for centuries, but whose names were essentially discarded by the scribes. If you've ever read through the early chapters of Genesis, you probably remember the big headlines: the murder of Abel, the mark of Cain, the genealogy of the patriarchs. But we tend to glide over the connective tissue, the little snippets of text that are actually doing the heavy lifting. One of those details sits right in the middle of Genesis 5, verse 4. It is so brief you could blink and miss it. The text says, "And the days of Adam after he had begotten Seth were 800 years, and he begat sons and daughters." Pause on that for a second. 800 years! That is not a footnote. That is a massive, sprawling era of human history. That is roughly the same amount of time that separates us from the height of the Middle Ages. But the text provides us with these 2 generic categories, sons and daughters, and then just moves on. It doesn't name them, it doesn't describe their lives or their impact on that early world. I've read this verse dozens of times, and honestly, it's easy to treat it as filler. But when you pause and actually do the math, it ceases to be a detail and becomes a massive omission. Why did we get the name of every single male descendant in the line of Seth? Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared? But the daughters are erased. It isn't just that they aren't important to the salvation history narrative. Their absence creates a total void where a vibrant, complex society should be. We assume there is silence because there is nothing to say, but the evidence points to the opposite. The silence is a specific, intentional curation. Now, I'm not the first person to notice this. If you move outside the standard biblical canon, specifically into texts like the Book of Jubilees, the silence actually breaks. The text starts talking. Jubilees explicitly names the daughters of Adam and Eve, Awan and Azura. Suddenly, the shadows have faces. We aren't just looking at generic sons and daughters anymore. We're looking at individual women who had to survive in a harsh, new, unmapped world. Why did the Book of Jubilees feel the need to name them while the canonical text of Genesis did not? It suggests there was an oral tradition, a memory of these women, that existed, but it was filtered out of the final version of the Torah. When I see names like Awan and Azura, it feels like finding a piece of a puzzle under the couch. It makes you realize that the silence wasn't a lack of information, it was a choice to manage the narrative. When you don't name the daughters, you don't have to explain how the world was actually populated. You can skip the social structure. The silence allows the narrative to remain clean, noble, and linear, but it also creates a massive historical blind spot. When I look at this now, I can't help but feel we have lost something vital. We read Genesis as a story about great men, but those men were surrounded by people whose lives were just as long, just as meaningful, and just as important to the survival of humanity. Awan and Azura didn't just exist, they were the first generation of mothers. They were the ones who had to figure out how to live outside the garden, how to cultivate the soil, how to organize a family in a world that was still forming. And yet, their history is a void. This is the part that changes how I see the whole thing. The silence isn't just about what was left out, it is about who was deemed worthy of being remembered. This makes me wonder about the other gaps. If the daughters of Adam and Eve were pushed into the shadows, who else has been silenced to preserve the narrative? How many other foundational truths were edited out because they didn't fit the specific, narrow, patriarchal line of the covenant? We aren't just talking about Genesis. We're talking about how we construct our own history, how we decide what counts as significant and what counts as background noise. What happens when we finally start listening to the silence instead of just the words? The first couple in history received one clear, non-negotiable command: be fruitful and multiply. It reads like a blessing, right? A divine mandate to fill the void. But if you look at the Genesis record with a cold, analytical eye, the math hits a violent collision course with the foundations of human morality. We see the names of the sons, Cain, Abel, Seth, but the daughters are ghosts. This is not just a biblical omission. It is a silence so heavy that it forces us to reconsider the foundations of our origin. We're looking at the shadows of the first family, a scene lit by the guttering flame of a campfire in a world that had not yet learned to be civilized. We're scrutinizing the survival of our species, a survival that required bypassing what we now consider a universal moral barrier. When that first pair stepped out of the garden, the air changed. The humidity of the earth was thick, the dampness of the soil clung to their feet, and the silence of the wilderness was not the peace of a refuge. It was the suffocating silence of an infinite, empty cathedral. There were no landmarks, no maps, no other tribes to trade with. Just a man, a woman, and the encroaching darkness of an unmapped world. Survival was not a guarantee. It was a daily, grueling labor, a negotiation with a nature that had suddenly turned indifferent. When we read the command to multiply, we see it as a distant, ancient blessing. But pause on that. In this post-Eden reality, children were a biological necessity. They needed hands to till the soil, protection against a wild, untamed wilderness, and a bulwark against the crushing weight of an infinite, terrifying solitude. Think about the quiet panic of being the only two human beings on the planet. They were standing at the edge of an abyss, tasked with populating it. The garden was already a memory, a haze of regret. Now there was only the physical, carnal reality of reproduction. If Adam and Eve were the literal, singular point of origin for humanity, the genetic bottleneck of the species, how did they actually pull this off? The math is relentless. One couple cannot spawn a civilization without some very close, very uncomfortable proximity between their offspring. We look back through the lens of modern morality and see a line drawn in the sand, a universal taboo against sibling marriage. It feels like a law of nature, written into our biology. But if we accept the premise of a singular human pair, that taboo had to be set aside for the species to persist. Survival was not a suggestion, it was a physical imperative. The Genesis text leaves us a hollow space where the daughter should be. But there are ancient, non-canonical manuscripts that refuse this silence. Texts that act as a restoration of the missing pieces of our ancestry. Documents like the Book of Jubilees and the Cave of Treasures serve as a lens, sharpening the blur. When you read the Book of Jubilees, a text originating from the Second Temple period, the shadows lift. It provides names: Awan, Kalima, Azura. When I first traced these names, it felt like finding a missing piece of a photograph you assumed was complete. We are looking at individual women who had to inhabit the raw, unmapped world left after the expulsion. These were not theoretical figures. They were the structural pillars of the first generation. The Cave of Treasures, a Syriac document that attempts to organize these genealogies, goes further. It details specific pairings, mapping out who married whom to ensure the lineage continued. It shifts our perspective from a vague mathematical puzzle to a documented, albeit strange, human history. It reminds us that these people lived in a world of stark, binary choices. Now, here is where it gets interesting. Look at the Seth and Abel dynamic. We often treat Abel as the martyr and Seth as the replacement. A simple, clean swap and a narrative ledger. But think about the weight that carries. In a world with only one set of parents, the arrival of each child was a high-stakes gamble. By framing Seth as a substitute for Abel, the ancient scribes weren't just writing a genealogy. They were justifying the necessary and logistically strange unions that followed. Seth wasn't just a child, he was the structural repair for a family unit that had been shattered by fratricide. To replace Abel was to restore the potential for the future. The ancient texts suggest that the partners of these men were their own sisters. And if we view this through the lens of necessity rather than morality, the tension shifts. It becomes an engineering problem. If the lineage of Seth and Cain was to continue, the compensation for the loss of Abel wasn't just the birth of a new boy. It was the strategic creation of new unions. It was the only way to avoid an immediate catastrophic dead end. When I sit with these lists, I look at the ancient Near Eastern context, trying to understand the bookkeeping of the ancients. Why leave the daughters out? It wasn't just a quirk of history or a minor oversight. Let me back up for a second. In that era, a family's status was measured by the strength of their alliances. Daughters were political currency. When you married off a daughter, she moved into a new fiduciary sphere. Her children belonged to her husband's clan. In a world of strict patrilineal inheritance, where land and livestock were tethered to the father's name, documenting a daughter was like documenting an expenditure. You see this in endangered species today. When the population narrows down to just a few, you inevitably see the expression of recessive traits, the biological cost of a dwindling gene pool. If you trace the maternal line back through the millennia, every living human can be mapped to one woman who lived roughly 150,000 to 200,000 years ago. Scientists call her Mitochondrial Eve. It doesn't mean she was the only woman alive, but it means she is the only one whose unbroken maternal line survived to reach us. Whether you approach this through the lens of faith or the cold, precise machinery of genomic sequencing, you land on the same strange realization. We are all descended from a single source. It is as if the ancient texts were describing the exact phenomenon we now see through modern science, documenting a genetic bottleneck that required extreme measures. We are left with a paradox. We started with the necessity of Awan and Azura, sisters and wives, stitching together a thread of life against a backdrop of potential extinction. This was not a choice made in freedom. It was a command written into the biology of survival. Yet, somewhere in the widening distance of history, that necessity hardened into prohibition. The very act required to seed the world became the ultimate taboo. We trace our bloodline back to that singular, lonely pair, and we are still struggling to answer the core tension. If the survival of the human race once relied on the total suspension of what we now consider sacred law, does that mean morality is a static set of rules? At what point did the necessity of the first generation become the taboo of the next? The ledger remains open. The daughters are named, the lineage is traced, and survival was secured. We are the survivors of that necessity. And honestly, the question is not whether the act was moral by our standards, but whether our standards could even exist without the brutal, logical choices made at the very dawn of our timeline. The silence of the daughters is not a loss. It is a testament. We are the result of choices we cannot fully understand, built upon a foundation that defied everything we now believe is right. Our existence is, in every sense, an exception to the rule. Imagine we are standing in a cramped, dimly lit scriptorium from the Second Temple period. It smells of lamp oil and scraped animal skin. This isn't where official, state-sanctioned law was written. This is where the people's questions were debated. You could almost see the scribes huddled over their desks, wrestling with this massive, uncomfortable void. The official Torah gave them the framework, sure, but it left a vacuum where an entire generation of lives should have been. And human beings? We do not do well with vacuums. We crave continuity. So in these back-alley workshops, they didn't just accept the absence, they filled it. They didn't rewrite the law, no, they added a footnote. And this is where the official history ended, and a much messier, more human tradition began. But if you view these names only as a way to solve a biological equation, you're missing the point. There is a deeper layer here. In texts like the Cave of Treasures, these women aren't just empty vessels for a bloodline. They are cast as figures of real agency. They're often portrayed as the first keepers of household wisdom, the ones navigating the transition from the pastoral ease of Eden to the harsh, structured reality of the post-fall world. Let's actually look closer at the Cave of Treasures, because this is where it gets fascinating. These women are given roles that feel almost mythic. Take the daughter often associated with the early domestic arts. In the tradition, she's not just a wife. She's described as the one who codified the processing of flax. Think about that transition for a second. We're talking about moving from the simple, pastoral life of the garden to a reality that demanded labor to survive. By assigning her the specific knowledge of fiber arts, the text is saying she wasn't just there, she was a pioneer. She was the one who figured out how to strip the plant, treat the fiber, and weave it into a protective layer against the elements. It's a massive technological leap. By attributing this to her, the authors turn a daughter into the first engineer of human comfort. She's the one who realized that if you treat the raw material a certain way, it becomes cloth, a barrier between the body and the harshness of the unmapped world. It's a way of signaling that the survival of the human race wasn't just about reproduction, it was about the advancement of utility. It turns these women from historical footnotes into the true architects of that first society. When we shift from the silence of Genesis to the noise of the Apocrypha, we get names. Awan, Azura. It feels like an excavation, like brushing the dirt off a name tag buried for millennia. But let's analyze what these names actually represent. In ancient literary traditions, names were rarely just identifiers, they were definitions. Take the name Awan. In certain Semitic roots, it connects to strength or potency, but in others, it drifts toward iniquity or transgression. Think about that. If you're a scribe trying to explain why Cain became a wanderer, why not name his wife something that sounds like the very concept of the transgression he committed? The names act as thematic anchors. But, and this is where I get skeptical, if these names were invented long after the fact to serve a theological point, to sanitize the messy genealogy, then we aren't looking at historical records. We're looking at literary engineering. I am deeply skeptical that these should be treated as biographical data. They function more like archetypes. They aren't people in the way we use the word. They are structural components of a narrative that needed to be completed. Once you see that pattern, you cannot unsee it. The missing daughters were filled in, not with history, but with terminology that reinforced the moral of the story. Now, if you're wondering where these extra-canonical authors pulled these names from, you're not alone. It's not just a blank page where they started brainstorming. When you look at the Book of Jubilees, there is this sense of restorative history, an attempt to plug the holes in a narrative that felt incomplete. The Jubilees author was obsessed with order, with time, with the strict categorization of the Jubilee years. They were likely synthesizing oral traditions that had been swirling for centuries, standardizing them to fit a rigid, legalistic framework. The official, canonical Torah was the public, state-sanctioned history, but around the hearth, in the villages, the story of the first family was being colored in. The human brain simply refuses to accept a void where a person should be. They were building a bridge between the sparse, covenantal history and the reality of their own lives. These names acted as anchors. They transformed a list of abstract patriarchs into a lived-in human reality. Consider the contrast. In the Book of Jubilees, the naming of these daughters feels like a bureaucratic necessity. It lists them to track who married whom, almost like an accounting of tribal assets. It's dry, rigid, and concerned with the preservation of the sacred line. Now compare that to the Cave of Treasures, a text from a different, arguably more mystical tradition. There, the daughters are given roles that feel more mythic, almost foundational. They are part of the inheritance. They are given to the sons of Seth and Cain, not just to propagate the race, but to distribute the wisdom of the garden. The Cave of Treasures treats these women as repositories of memory. The difference is telling. One text uses names to build a law, the other uses names to build a myth. Both are valid, but they are serving entirely different social functions. We hit what I call a genre gap. The Bible isn't an anthropology textbook. It's a book of covenant. Its authors had one goal, establishing the lineage of the faithful. But this focus meant they treated human lives as disposable data points. If a woman didn't carry the lineage forward, she didn't exist for the record. Therefore, the daughters were left in the margins, or erased entirely. This creates a fascinating tension. The official text gives us a sanitized, linear, and strictly male genealogy. But the people reading those texts were curious social creatures who needed to fill the gaps in their own origin story. When they reached for names like Awan or Kalima, they were asserting that the first generation had to be as complex and populous as their own. They were fighting the silence of the page. By assigning these names, they were forcing the first generation to reflect the world they actually lived in. We started this by looking at a blank space in a verse. We end it by realizing that the space was never really empty. It was waiting to be filled by the needs of whoever held the pen. The act of naming, taking Kalima or Awan, and binding them to the timeline of Eden was never about historical accuracy. It was an act of reclamation. It was an act of definition. By forcing these figures into existence, ancient communities weren't just creating characters, they were creating the rules for how a clan should behave. When we stop asking, who were they, and start asking, who were we trying to create when we name them, the story finally makes sense. It was never about the daughters. It was always about the people who needed to fill the silence. The mystery isn't whether Awan or Azura existed. The mystery is why we cannot stand it when a piece of our story is left unwritten.